I'm your host, Richard Franzi. This is podcast episode number 1150. You couldn't tell it from that introduction, could you? Sustany Capital invests in blockchain technologies to help reshape business landscape. One of their main emphasis is tokenization strategies and smart contracts. I've invited Christian Kameir here today to talk about their blockchain and cryptocurrency involvement and the space, and to just generally educate our listening audience about these exciting new technologies. Christian, welcome to Critical Mass Radio Show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, before we get into that, let's talk a bit about you.
Sure.
Give us a little background, an interesting story, kind of set the context for you as an entrepreneur.
Sure. The first obvious thing is that you probably noticed that I have an accent, so I moved to the United States in 2000 after we sold our internet service provider back in Germany at the right time, so stopped being a lawyer at that point in time, became a venture capitalist, and started investing mainly in multi-massive online player games and voice over IP technology back in 2000. I've been doing some form of investing and some form of entrepreneurship ever since.
Why Southern California?
Well, the weather.
Okay, really? So
No.
you had the choice to relocate?
Yeah, so no, really what happened was we were looking at a company in Carlsbad, of all things, to invest in when I was still living back in Hamburg. And I touched down in San Diego at the time, and it felt like coming home. Sounds odd, but
Right.
It felt like that's where I needed to be. So I phoned home, said, I'm moving here, and
Wow.
6 months later I moved here.
Had you been here before?
Not specifically to California. So,
Okay.
Not specifically to Southern California. I visited San Francisco a few times, Los Angeles a few times, but not this particular area, and I really love it. So
Well, say no
What's
more.
not to love,
Right.
right?
Well,
What's not to love?
what's not to love about Southern California? So, can I peel back that a little bit? Because
Sure.
from your experience now being a global entrepreneur, right, having
Right.
successfully scaled a company in a foreign
Right.
country, at least to us it is, and now doing it again here in the U.S., can you
Right.
just share a little bit about your direct experience about comparing and contrasting that?
Yeah, a few things that immediately kind of stood out to me, having my particular background in technology and then B in law, was like a lot of things that are very obviously different are things like privacy back then, for example. Like a lot of things that the credit agencies do here and have been doing for a long time would be illegal where I'm from. I taught privacy law right out of law school before getting into the technology space. And so this is becoming now more obvious with California introducing their own GDPR-like privacy laws and et cetera. So that's very reminiscent of what I expected to find, and I didn't. I was actually shocked of what all these companies could do with your data, collect it, sell it, et cetera. So that was very different.
So
very
that's a
obvious.
uniquely American situation here?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I don't know if it's uniquely American, but it's definitely very different from a European
not European,
context. I
right.
don't know if you're familiar with the GDPR in particular, but that's basically what California is introducing now. That's
Right.
very, very similarly fashioned, and it kind of also reaches into the whole blockchain space because you need to solve these identity problems that you have, right? So on one hand, you got identity problems in the developing nations where there's more than 1 billion people that don't have identity documentation, right? So by definition, they can't participate in the modern world, right? You can't open up a bank account and so forth, and that's more than 1 billion people. And then on the other hand, you got a lot of people in the developed nations. They had their identity compromised, right? So Equifax had a breach with 146 million identities. So what that basically means is that every U.S. identity is available on the black market for pennies on the dollar to be had for anybody to then assign rights to, right? If you extend this particularly to the blockchain space, but I guess we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute. But so from a ecosystem around an entrepreneur, from your experience in Germany and now your experience scaling a business here in Southern California, can you give us some sense for the difference?
Well, the U.S. entirely is a little more, let's say, entrepreneurial friendly to where you got more venture capital, obviously. That's the most obvious part. That's why everybody is kind of streaming specifically into the Bay Area. But then also where I'm coming from, we have a very rigid kind of educational system. Has its pros, but also has a lot of cons, right? So you can't call yourself anything where I'm from unless you actually went to school for it. You went to either a vocational school or trade school and actually have a quote-unquote degree in that particular subject. And here, anybody that's self-taught can do whatever they want, basically. And that's particularly true in a lot of the entrepreneurial endeavors where by definition, in like where I'm from, you would be excluded. Like that would be the first thing that people want to check off. Do you have a degree in that particular field that you're trying to operate in? And you don't. It's like, well, you're probably not even able to do that, right? So that's very restricting. That's why entrepreneurship in Germany in particular is like a third of what it's here.
Interesting.
And accordingly, also venture capital is much smaller than it is here. But again, that's very specific to Southern California, where you have a lot of concentrated venture capital based on its history.
So let's bring this, kind of put a bow on it. But
sure.
When you talk to your friends who are entrepreneurs and business owners back in Germany,
right?
Are they... how do they respond to these degrees of freedom that you're now experiencing?
To be honest, I don't have all that much contact anymore.
No?
I'm actually just trying to reestablish contact because I've been so focused on just local businesses, basically. And actually just talked to this morning to some new business partners back in Britain to see how we can do some of that technology transfer that's coming from there. Because what you'll see is specifically in this new technology space, there are certain developments that are being driven by certain cultures. So as I alluded to earlier, if you're very sensitive to privacy, you already gave this a lot of thought, right? There's a lot of legal background. At the same time, if you look at things like the euro, right? So there were a lot of people involved making this happen, right? To make one currency happen for a lot of different countries. And so that's a very specific skill set that these people developed for a decade or more that you can now deploy in this new paradigm of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, because you need to understand how economies work and how economies work cross borders, which is something, again, where the United States has somewhat of a disadvantage for being somewhat of an island, being not directly exposed to other cultures, other currencies, other countries, to where if you have been educated in any of the smaller European countries, you most likely immediately got exposed to a lot of different jurisdictions that you had to interact with and respond to and so forth, right? So that gives you a different perspective and makes you consider other cultures, other regulations and so forth. And the United States, for the most part, could just act with inside of their borders, right? If you're a lawyer in Los Angeles, chances are all you ever do is that particular little field of law. You're never exposed to any international contracts that have to do with France or Italy, for that matter. You're just going to be an injury lawyer in Los Angeles, so to speak.
Or maybe you'll do business in Nevada.
Yeah, but
or
you got the largest consumer market in your reach, so it's going to be some time before you run out of clients or purchases of your product before you actually make the jump to another jurisdiction and introduce another complication like another language and or another legal system. But,
So, Christian, let's turn our attention now to you and how you decided this chapter of your entrepreneurial career should be around these technologies. What was it that got you saying that's the next phase and what I want to do?
Right. So initially when I got into internet, I was super excited about all its possibilities. I read the original works of Tim Berners-Lee, and he basically in his original work, so he created the HTML, which kind of makes up the World Wide Web as we see it today still. And so I really got excited about the idea of connecting brains. So that was kind of the vision in the way that I described that. And this really hasn't happened. So what I mean by that is we created kind of this centralized monolith where only a few companies provide access to it and a few companies direct eyeballs on top of that, right? And so about 12 years ago, I started writing an outline on that to see how could we decentralize that? Like what would be the steps that would be needed to secure an equal distribution of content, make sure that you're not inundated with advertising and so forth. And so when I first came across Bitcoin, I didn't actually think it was all that important because I only looked at its currency aspect. But then when I read the Ethereum white paper, I realized, the smart contract system enables something that I wanted to do for a long time, which is put all of the lawyers out of business, including myself. And I did this before. But the point there being is that if you create a structure where you let everybody actually contribute, you don't need those bottlenecks anymore, right? And so to this day, we don't have a search engine, right? So Google is not a search engine. Google is an advertising company, right? You define a company by how it makes its money. It makes its money 100% from advertising. You are not Google's client unless you participate in AdWords, but I I don't know if you do, but it doesn't matter because you definitely use Google for searches, right? But in that context, you're actually the product that Google is selling to their advertisers, right? So that creates this misalignment of interest where you hopefully and naturally would want the best result from your search engine, right? That is most useful to you, but that's not in their best interest, right? Because if they present you with the best result right away, you click on that and you don't click on any ads. So their optimization, that holds true for Facebook and the other social media companies, is mainly directed towards commercializing you, right? Commercializing your data, collecting your data, selling it back to the advertisers.
Sure.
That's what their business is about. And unless you change that paradigm, which is hard to do if you're a for-profit corporation that is responsible to shareholders, then you aren't very likely to fix that, right? And I went down another rabbit hole, and I tend to do that, so stop me whenever I do.
No, so our audience are entrepreneurs and business owners running companies kind of a couple $1 million to $100 million across all different spaces across North America.
Right.
So I'd like to, with your knowledge of blockchain and Bitcoin, help them to become more comfortable with the coming wave of what smart contracts could mean to their business and how they might be able to leverage what you're seeing based on your focus.
Right. So the very big picture, and then we can kind of hone in on a couple of examples, but the very big picture is an economy exists of two main things. You got production and consumption, right? And in between you got intermediaries and mechanisms to bridge the gap, right? We used to be agrarian societies where you lived off the land, and we kind of switch this around for most people don't produce the things that they consume anymore. But what you had to do is you had to create these middlemen, right? And in the sense also those middleware and middle layers like money and currencies, like currency solves the double coincidence of one's problem, right? And that's what Bitcoin addresses, right? So it's the currency aspect. The money aspect, and that's what most people don't quite understand, is simply the agreement that we agree that this is money. So that's the only part to that. And that's kind of basic economic fundamentals that people need to recollect, because we're still using legacy definitions of all these terms that don't fit current technology anymore. So fast forward, so speaking of other currencies, and other currencies could be mechanisms of transportation of information. So if you look back in time, when the internet was introduced, it interrupted a lot of different industries, but mostly those that had to do with distributing information. So the publishing industries, right? So publishers have suffered tremendously from that, because everything is moving online before you can ever publish this on paper. Obviously, you will find that online, and so they went out of business for the most part. And the few remaining ones are either putting up paywalls, like the New York Times, and or finding other ways of revenues, like organizing events and so forth. But so all the other protocols that came after, they are as interesting, like voice over IP, for example, right? So all of a sudden, no one has to pay by the minute anymore. And then most importantly, email. You probably send way more emails than you send postal letters today, right? So
sure, who doesn't?
And so what Bitcoin introduced was money over IP. So it's the same kind of paradigm to where, hey, why would I need the privilege from a bank and or a credit card that taxes me, or even government money, which is also a tax, right? So by the virtue of the government printing money, it's just another form of tax. So in essence, they should make up their mind. It's like, are you taxing me or printing money? Choose one, because both are taxes. But so the short story here for a business, to bring this full circle, hopefully, is that you want to look out for those reduction in middlemen. So it's going to start with financial services first, as much as you can. So if you're a business, let's say you're deploying a point of sale system, look for one that's starting to deploy decentralized ledgers. So decentralized ledgers is the generic term for blockchain, right? And so start to look for banks that do real-time settlements, which are coming this year. So normal banks until today are still using the SWIFT system, which is to say they have bank hours, right? So you can't actually settle anything between the hours of after 6 p.m. to whatever 9 in the morning when they offer, and not on the weekends. I mean, it's literally like you're shutting off emails, like, or you don't, right? And so at the time when we had email, we should also at the same time had introduced money over IP. So the banks are still pushing against that, although we already know of some that are actually actively working towards solutions for that. And then what comes with that is instant settlement and instant availability of your money, right? Super important. And then also reduction of any merchant fees and things like microtransactions right now, not possible, right? If you have a merchant account, there's a minimum fee per transaction. And so you can't charge 5 cents because charging 5 cents costs you 30 cents in total, right? So
it's not worth it, right?
And so there's a lot of things along that line. But then most importantly, what we should be looking for is solving the identity, and the other part is solving asset management. So what I mean by that, there's a lot of talk about this whole topic of quote-unquote security tokens. They don't exist. They will never exist until we solve identity. The reason being is that security is any form of ownership. It's a key lock system, because some of the criteria you're looking for, they're inherent in you. It's your position as an accredited investor, or you're a citizen or non-US citizen, or whatever you might have. And then on the other side, you have assets that go with certain ownership rights and that require certain type of person. So as long as you're introducing yet another middleman, you might as well stay with the current paradigm. So as long as you're creating a platform, you actually don't have a token. A token in a blockchain context is a peer-to-peer instrument. So it's being deployed in the sense of what I initially described as in the voice over IP system, but now it's assets over protocol, any type of asset. But what it requires is that we introduce all the protocols that solve all the endpoints, so that we don't need these middlemen anymore for on-ramps. So right now you need to go to a bank and deal with fiat currencies in order to buy cryptocurrencies. Eventually that will be alleviated. And if you look in other nations where they didn't have this legacy technology debt, which the SWIFT system and bankings are. So if you look to sub-Saharan Africa, there the majority of their GDP already moves through digital currencies, or like you've probably heard of M-Pesa, for example. So those are all foreshadowing what's going to happen here. We don't have the necessity or the need right now, because you and I have credit cards, we have bank accounts, we have identity documents, but you got billions of people in other countries. For them, it's an immediate need. It's not something that's nice to have. It's not something to speculate. It's something that they need to use.
So from your perspective, Christian, because I got the sign from the engineer that, believe it or not, we've used up most of our time. Who's going to be disintermediated by the combination of some type of cryptocurrency and then the blockchain technology of a distributed ledger?
Anybody at this point in time who's a rent-taking intermediary. So as monolithic as you are, the more vulnerable you are.
So bank.
A bank, Google, Facebook, anybody who doesn't align their interest with the actual stakeholders as well.
Would you suggest to a business owner that's listening to the show now or as a podcast in the future, the idea of beginning to figure out how to accept digital currency? And if so, how should they consider doing that to benefit their business?
Yeah, I mean, there are several solutions already, but obviously there's a lot of volatility in that space right now. So if you're relying for that on your general income and to pay your bills, that's probably not the best thing. Although there's stable coins, you probably have heard of that. So you could just accept those and probably put some bitcoins away, basically, right? It's like virtual golds. Again, anybody who doesn't have 5% of their net worth in that particular asset class, and I'm sort of reluctant to use that term, honestly, but is probably negligent at this point in time, because the likelihood that they prevail is pretty high. I mean, for even if you shut down the internet, Bitcoin would still work and would still exist, as one example. But obviously there's many more. But yeah, start there. Start accepting cryptocurrencies, just starting.
But Bitcoin is only one of many cryptocurrencies.
Yes, and honestly, I wouldn't call it a cryptocurrency at this point in time. That's, again, a very longer discussion, so I don't know if you want me to go down that rabbit hole.
We don't have time for that, but what is the headline on why you wouldn't call it a cryptocurrency? Because they do, right? I mean, it is. articles refer to it that way.
Yeah, it's a catchy term, right? But
Okay.
it's kind of like everybody's calling the space crypto. That's kind of like referring to the internet as secure socket layer.
Okay.
It's a
Geeky.
it's an interesting term, but it doesn't really describe what the technology does. So and Bitcoin at this moment in time is really the virtual gold. So it's a commodity. So it's not actually a currency. It's not used as a
so
currency.
think of it more as a commodity
Yes.
than a currency.
So it was meant as a
very
currency,
useful. Thank
but
you.
it doesn't function as such. So again, in order to very simply just define what a currency is, it simply
Right.
solves the double coincidence of one's problem, which is that it's just not. It doesn't have a lot of utility. You can't go to your local Starbucks right now and pay with it.
Right.
So that's what you were looking for in quote unquote good money. Obviously, you want to be able to move around and pay with it. Right. That's
Okay.
one of its very aspects. But that's what stable coins are trying to do.
Stable coins.
Right.
Okay. But you can also then focus on blockchain technology and distributor ledger without getting caught up in the coins and the
Right.
Okay.
And that you want to do for, let's say, things like tracking provenance of something. So you heard of CryptoKitties, right? So CryptoKitties, the reason why people were so excited about, and they raised a lot of money before this protocol was even forked into the mainnet of the Ethereum blockchain, was that idea of, hey, you create all of a sudden non-fungible assets. So your typical US dollar is fungible, right? So $1 replaces another one, is exactly the same. So what this new standard, the ERC 721 standard that makes a CryptoKitty described as a non-fungible electronic asset, which has very far-reaching implications to where this standard and the advancement of this standard will put platforms such as iTunes out of business, because iTunes exists for digital rights management, right? So it's the idea that I limit the usage of that particular song or video to your 5 devices specifically, and Apple manages that, and it charges, the company charges like 25% or something for doing so, right? With blockchain technology, you don't need this particular digital rights management system anymore. It's inherent in the digital asset itself. And so you will see a lot of these paradigms creeping into other assets, because music and MP3, MP4, those are natively digital, but other things will become natively digital, where things are quote unquote born on the blockchain. So you can envision that something jumps off the distribution line and it exists on the blockchain right away. Right? It doesn't matter if it's your iPhone with its unique device ID, you can track it back to its provenance, where it was bought, where it was sold, who holds it right now, and so forth. And in a lot of scenarios, that makes a huge difference, right? I mean, a dollar is the same as another dollar unless you find one that Elvis signed, right? So all of a sudden you wouldn't trade it anymore. But for a lot of other items, you actually want to know that this, let's say, medication or this particular technology piece has not been altered, has not been sold by a criminal, let's say.
Right.
And blockchain technology and the new protocols on top of it enable all of those with all the middlemen that testify to the provenance of that. And that's a large part of what the population and modern economies evolve around today. Like if you think about your escrow agent, etc. So in a few decades from now, it will seem entirely strange for us to not be able to sell a house between the two of us directly using a
with
phone.
no middleman.
Right? So that's kind of the high level. But there's obviously way more granular detail that I could talk about.
Yeah, and we should have allocated more time next time. And the challenge is, I'm sure you know, Christian, is you use so many terms that people are confused about that it's hard to follow the logic and the compellingness of the underlying platform. So in the future, we should probably attempt to demystify some of that, but not today.
Yeah.
If someone wants to learn more about what you're doing, where do you tell them to go online?
Sure. If you just look for Sustany Capital, you'll find us.
How do you spell that?
That's SUSTANY.
Okay.
And then capital. And
why'd you pick that name?
It stands for sustainability.
Okay.
And that's what we're looking for. So we look for investments 3-5 years down the road where something is actually being built. We are not into speculating.
Okay.
We want to support that particular ecosystem. We love that space. We love technology. And that's what we're in for. And that's why we're engaged with all different projects that are actually building the infrastructure now.
Now, you said, I don't know, something like 10 or 20 years from now. Do you really think it's going to take that long? Or do you think there's a tipping point and it may happen more in a more accelerated fashion?
Oh, yeah, it could happen much faster, obviously. I mean, from the first time the iPhone got into your hands to today, it's been just 11 or 12 years, right? So,
Wow.
and it's prevalent now, right? So
right.
everybody in this country basically has a smartphone of one shape or the other, and blockchain technology already has all the rails it needs, right? The infrastructure in form of IP is already there. So now it's really mostly about agreeing on the standards on top of this infrastructure at this moment.
So maybe when you come back, we'll talk about smart contracts. How's that? Because that's a definite thing that middle market business owners should be thinking about, in my opinion, the use of and the evolution of smart contracts. Do you agree?
Well, that's very granular, to be honest.
Okay.
I mean, they probably don't have to even know about smart contracts. There
Really?
will be there will be very specific applications that they can employ that are built using smart contracts.
Okay. Well, the concept of a smart contract is something I'd like them to understand, because you talk about eliminating middlemen even more. This really cleans up the transactions.
Super easy to explain.
Okay.
Envision a vending machine, throw in a quarter, a Coke comes out. That's your smart contract.
Okay, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Christian, for being a guest on the radio show today.
Thank
I
you for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
We've covered a lot of ground very quickly, and I'd like to
talk
thank
fast.
Paul Roberts with a slight accent for being a wonderful engineer, as he always is. Our producers, without whom we could not do this show, Joan Park, Crystal Nunley, and Haley Stern. If you'd like to connect with me, let's do it on LinkedIn. I'm Richard Franzi, Franzi. Till our next show, hope all of your business decisions moves your company in a positive direction.